Hey guys, and welcome to this tutorial. Today I'm gonna show you how to draw a portrait using a black crayon, a pencil and charcoal. If you don't have charcoal at hand, you may try to use the pencil instead, but be aware that it's much harder to achieve this look without charcoal, since its soft and buttery consistency enables you to create much smoother and lighter shadows than a pencil might do for you, especially if you're a beginner. However, this tutorial is meant for everybody, no matter what stage of drawing skills you are at. So, without further ado, let's begin by sketching out the girl's face. So, first of all, let's quickly analyze the shape of the girl's face in our reference picture. As you can see, she has a pretty oval face. Other people might have heart-shaped faces, round faces, etc. So figuring out which shape you need to draw is quite helpful for getting the portrait right. Because once you've determined which shape a face has, but struggle to get it right when attempting to draw said face, you can apply a little trick. For instance, since I know that this girl has an oval face, I could simply lay an oval shape over her face on the reference picture and sketch out that oval on paper. Then I would already have gotten the basic form of her face right and could make adjustments according to how the face differs from the oval in the reference picture, and could make the chin, her cheeks and forehead more detailed. Another option would be to lay a grid like this one over the girl's head, which might give you an even better and detailed idea about the shape of her face, as well as on her facial features, due to all these little fields on which one can orientate oneself. I noticed that the girl's left cheek seemed a little bit fuller or rounder than the right one, due to the position her head is in. Also, I didn't include the hand beneath her chin in this portrait, because these aren't that easy to draw for beginners, and just covered that part up with hair, as you're gonna see later on. I began to draw her face from her chin on, upwards to her hairline. If you struggle with this approach, try to draw downwards from her forehead towards her chin, for instance, or look for another starting point. Keep in mind to make the left cheek rounder than the right one. Once you've drawn the shape of her face, pick a facial feature to begin with and try to figure out where exactly said feature is positioned. You can always use a grid like the one I was just talking about to do so. There are a few general rules or guidelines for facial features, which I explained in another clip of mine, which I'm gonna link down below if you're interested. But since every face is different and often differs from these guidelines in some way, I recommend to create your own individual guidelines or to check how much the face differs from the common ones. For instance, you can see that our girl's eyes are halfway down the head, and that her face is half as wide as it is long, which exceptionally actually is the case for most people, as well as the eyes being halfway down the head, whereas her face can't exactly be divided into 3 equal parts lengthwise. Her forehead takes in slightly less space than a third, and her nose a little bit more. On the other hand, the sides of her nose almost line up with her tear ducts, which actually complies with the common guidelines for facial features, as well as the mouth being slightly wider than the nose. So, as I've already mentioned, I began sketching out the mouth first. If you don't really know how to do that, this next trick might interest you as well. On the left side, there's a general grid for drawing lips, But again, this doesn't match the lips of the girl in our reference picture, so we've got to adjust this a little bit. Therefore, I drew a little cross-shaped grid on the girl's mouth in the reference picture, marking the corners and the center of her mouth. Again, I copied this cross on the paper and added these bow-like or almond-like shapes representing her lower and upper lip. Then I added this upper triangle for the cupid's bow and the middle part of the upper lip's inner outline in another bow-like form. You might as well adjust the upper lip completely right now, since I did that a few seconds later on. Next, I adjusted the lower lip's shape around its sides, erased that grid, and added these two lines just beneath the mouth. Also, I did end up making the left side of the cupid's bow a little bit rounder and the corners of the mouth more defined. Alternatively, here's how I drew the lips without this trick. Next, I worked on the nose. First, I drew the philtrum, the area between nose and upper lip. This philtrum usually starts at the peaks of the cupid's bow or close to them and ends at the sides of the nose. In our case, it is wider at the bottom, gets slightly thinner towards the nose wings and wider again, as well as slightly angled shortly before it reaches the sides of the nose. Then I position the pencil above and right in between the philtrum to find the center of the nose. From there on, I drew a small curved line, the bottom of the nose so to say, and dragged the line upwards in a circle-like shape. Because when you look closely, you can see that the girl in the picture has quite an upturned nose with a very distinct rounded tip. I added the nose wings on both sides, which are almost shaped like a C, before drawing the nostrils and almost line up with the corners of the mouth. Next, I sketched out the bridge of the nose, beginning with the area in between the eyes. The bridge of the nose should get smaller or thinner towards the middle and wider again towards the eyes, and should be slightly curved. Then I drew the first eye, beginning with the inner part, so to say, before I added the eyelid. The inner corner of the eye should almost line up with the left nose wing. Make sure that the eye has an almond-like shape with quite a distinct inner corner. Draw a fine line above the lower outline of the eye to picture the conjunctiva, separating the eyelid from the eye's surface. Drag the conjunctiva a little bit upwards next to the outer corner of the eye to separate that corner from the eye's surface. Last but not least, I added lashes by drawing fine, curvy lines on the eye's inner rim and dragging them upwards. The lashes should be the longest at the eye's outer corner and the smallest at the eye's inner corner. Also, the lashes on the left side should be bent towards the left and the lashes on the right side more to the right. Next, I sketched out the left eyebrow, which protrudes out a little bit over the nose bridge's edge and would line up with the left nostril's outer edge. When drawing the eyebrows outline, try to do this with several strokes, so that it already looks a little bit hairy, and try to include its irregularities. Eyebrows rarely look the same naturally, and usually differ in shape and thickness. Make the eyebrow slightly arched, angling downwards a little bit beyond the eye's outer corner. Then add the second eye the same way we drew the first one. When you try to find the second eye position, just keep in mind that between both eyes should fit another third eye, and that the inner corners of both eyes should be at the same height. Last but not least, add the second brow. Once I finished the face, I roughly lined out the hair. First, I worked on the hair beneath the ponytail, added the ponytail, which divides into two tails, one on each side, and then I also added the lower lashes, and sketched out a few more prominent strands of hair, giving the hair its movement and shape. The iris and pupils, as well as several moles the girl has on her face. And these two prominent lines beneath the eyes. Before we're getting to the next step though, let's take a quick look at how the basic shading method works, or how you can achieve a smooth color gradient, or in our case a smooth gradient from darkness to light. As you can see, there are 4 levels of darkness, with the black pen being the darkest and charcoal the lightest. I always like to build up shadows by starting with the darkest part and working my way towards the lightest part. However, if you're not quite sure how dark a shadow should be, slowly build it up by starting with a lighter tone or applying less pressure at first. The black pen is not always the best choice for the darkest parts of shadows, Since shadows come in different intensities and levels of darkness and hardness. So for a very light shadow, you might use the pencil or even charcoal for the darkest part. Now we are gonna try to do smooth gradients, first for each drawing utensil and then by using all of them together. Take the black pen and start drawing. First, create a very neat and fully covered area to make it as dark as possible. Press as hard as possible on the pen. The further you move towards the light, the more single strokes you should make and the less pressure you should put on the pen. Increase the distance between your strokes as well. It's totally fine if this part does look patchy. It's very hard to achieve a smooth gradient just using a pen. For the crayon, apply the most pressure where it should be the darkest and less the further you move towards the light. However, try to fully cover the whole field with crayon, so you don't need to do single strokes or increase the distance between your strokes. Now take a brush and brush over the whole area. Actually, you could also use a cut swab, since this works even better for crayon than the brush. Do the same procedure for the pencil, this time preferably with the brush again though. For the charcoal, put the most once again where it should be the darkest and less towards the light. You don't need to fully cover the field this time, since the charcoal spreads quite wide when you brush over it. Now we are gonna combine our utensils to create the perfect gradient from darkness to light. Begin with the black pen in the same way as we did a minute ago. Take the crayon and start drawing where the pen part fades out, which automatically fills in the patchy pen. Apply the most pressure on the transitioning area where the pen turns into crayon. Smoothen out the crayon part. Add the pencil, again not just next to the crayon, but already where it fades out, so draw a little bit over its edge, and brush this one out as well. Last but not least, add the charcoal. To make the charcoal blend into the white paper, just use the brush and try to drag it out as much as possible. Finally, take a brush and go over that whole thing a few times to make it really smooth. Well done guys, now you've already mastered the basic concept of shading. So guys, in order to prevent smudges, I decided to start with the left side of the girl's face. We are gonna try to determine the more prominent shadows on this area before sketching them out first. In our case, these are on the side of her cheek, beneath her chin, and around her eye and eyebrow, as well as on the corner of her mouth. I began by softly shading in the prominent shadow running down from her forehead to her eye. Therefore, I used the charcoal to sketch out said shadow before brushing it out. Make sure to place more charcoal on the shadow's bottom at the eye's corner, as well as at the eyebrow's tail, where it's the darkest, and just a little bit of charcoal where it is the brightest. You can make the shadow wider by dragging it out with the brush in small circular motions. However, also brush from the forehead down to the eye's corner and the other way around, following the shadow's shape lengthwise to make it look even. Then I carefully intensified the shadow at the eye's corner with the pencil and brushed it out again. Since we will sketch out all prominent shadows on the left side of her face first, before making it blend in with the surrounding skin, I already turned to the one on her cheek after I finished the previous shadow. Again, put the most charcoal at the edge of this part of her face, beside the ear, since that's the darkest part of our shadow, and drag it out towards her chin and eye to connect the shadows with each other. Next, I darkened the edge of her chin and jaw. Before connecting this shadow with the one on her cheek as well. Make sure to leave this bright area when doing so by placing very little charcoal in a bow-like shape and brushing over it in a curved motion. Then I also sketched out the shadow on her eyelid's edge, or rim so to say. And dragged it out towards the shadow running down her eyebrow again, since there would be another lighter shadow as well. Also, I sketched out the shadow above her eyebrow as well, which runs down from her forehead again and almost has a triangular-like shape. Once you've lightly sketched all prominent shadows out, you can begin to make them darker and more intense, which is exactly what I did by using the pencil or adding a little bit of charcoal around these areas. Next, I worked on the shadow on the corner of her mouth by placing a little bit of charcoal on that corner and carefully dragging it out towards the sides, as well as to the shadow on her jaw. Again, when you connect these two shadows, do so in a bow-like motion with your brush. Since I wanted it to be slightly darker at the corner, I intensified that area with the pencil, before connecting the lower part of the shadow with the lower part of the shadow on her jaw again. Basically, shadows on faces often run down in several directions and create very individual patterns, especially the light or very soft shadows. From far away, or if you take a quick glance at a picture, you won't notice these, but only the darker, more prominent shadows, whose shapes are somewhat more defined and clearly differentiate from the basic coloring or shade of the face. At the beginning, it can be very hard to figure out all these shadows and shapes, which is why we started by sketching out the more prominent shadows, directly catching your eye before working on the softer, finer branches, in which they run into and which create this overall pattern. Then I did the same thing on the other side of her forehead before turning to the inner part of that area. Note that the shadow running down towards her eyebrow's tail should be the darkest above her eyebrow, and to make it quite soft and light the further you move upwards towards the inner and upper part of her forehead. Be aware to leave that blank space between her hairline and upper part of her forehead, which is gonna be very bright. Next, I sketched out the shadow above her nose bridge, between both eyebrows. Beginning on its left side around the left eyebrow, and dragged it out again, slightly inwards in another bow-like shape and towards the light shadow at the top of her forehead. At this point I mainly use the charcoal powder, but again you might use the charcoal stick instead as well. Next, I drag the shadow further inwards with the brush and a little bit of charcoal powder towards the right eyebrow and the top of the forehead. And begin to connect the shadows by carefully letting them run out in little branches again and softly stroking over certain parts with the brush. When doing so, make sure to leave the inner upper part of the forehead brighter than the sides, which should be the darkest, and fade out towards the forehead's center. Last but not least, take a looser brush and just stroke over the whole forehead to make everything blend into each other. Just don't press too hard on it over the bright areas, otherwise they might get too dark. If you feel like certain areas are still too bright, use the charcoal to carefully intensify these parts, or just try stroking repeatedly and with more pressure over them with the brush, preferably a denser or more compact one. So then I worked on the side of her cheek by stroking several times again over the free space between the shadow on the girl's cheek, her eyebrow's tail and eye. Before adding a little bit of charcoal to the shadow on her cheek and brushed it out some more. Next, I worked on the shadows on her chin and intensified the one on her jaw as well. I dragged the shadow on her jaw and chin further out, inwards, and decided to take a little break from shading by adding a few molds on her forehead. While doing so, I felt like the space above her eyebrows was not dark enough and added a teeny tiny amount of charcoal powder. Then I added the eyebrows. Therefore, take the black crayon and draw several hairs where her brow seems to be the darkest. Make sure that these hairs grow in the same direction as in the reference picture, and to draw them slightly closer together than the remaining brow hairs. Take the pencil to fill in the single hairs in between. Again, press harder on the pencil where the brow should be darker and put less pressure on it where the hair seems to be lighter. The hairs at the brow's beginning should be a little bit wider apart from each other, and as you can see in the reference picture, the first longer hairs on her brow are very curved and darker at their roots. The first brow hairs should be shorter and finer as well as slightly brighter than the remaining hairs. However, the hairs at the tails of the brows are a little bit shorter again, with a few single hairs growing slightly irregularly and perking out a little bit. You can add a few very soft lines to picture single hairs growing a little bit over the eyebrow shape, directly above, and also a few under the brow. Once I was done with the brows, I turned to the left eye again, put another layer of charcoal on the eyelid and dragged it out towards the brow. Then I connected the shadow with the one running down her eyebrow in another bow-like shape, just using the brush, since I wanted this connecting shade to be quite subtle. So then I lined out the iris using a black pen to make them pop later on. I shaded in the iris by adding a layer of pencil next to the black rim we've just drawn with the pen. Before intensifying the shadow running down her forehead to the corner of her eye once again, using charcoal. Additionally, I darkened the shadow on the eyelid's edge as well, this time with the pencil though. Next, I sketched out the shadow under her left eye with charcoal. and turn to the shadow above her eyelid again. Drag the pencil a little bit inwards at the iris's top towards the pupil, which I filled in with the black pen as well, but keep in mind to leave these two little white spots where the light would be reflected, since the lashes and eyelid would cast a shadow on the upper part of the iris. Also, put more pressure on the pencil on that area. Additionally, once you've put a fine layer of pencil next to the outlined pupil, add several single short lines and individual strokes next to each other, poking towards the pupil. However, leave a little bit blank space between these lines and the pupil. Make the lines darker and longer on the upper part of the iris, and shorter and lighter towards the bottom. Then put a little bit of charcoal on the upper half of the iris, the most charcoal right at the top and slightly less next to the iris's rim. Brush it out, stroking in a circular motion, first over the upper half of the iris and then over the lower part. I used the black crayon to intensify the black rim of the iris again and dragged it a little bit inwards at the upper half. Added pencil and smoothed it out with the brush again. Then I softly erased the lower third of the iris, since I wanted this part to be brighter and to really pop. Again, I put a fine layer of pencil directly next to the black rim and added a few fine lines with the white acrylic paint on the eye's lower third, as well as to the two white spots in the pupil. Last but not least, I took the black pen and added a few fine lines at the iris's top again, poking from the black rim towards the pupil. And once again, I intensified a few shadows before working on the inner part of her eye. Take the pencil and draw a very soft and light shadow beneath her eyelid's inner edge, so to say. And at the eye's inner corner. As well as on the inner edge of her lower eyelid. Take the brush to smoothen it out and drag the shadow from her upper eyelid a little bit inwards. I carefully added a tiny amount of charcoal around that area and next to the inner corner of her eye to make it more intense. Make sure that the inner corner of the eye is separated by that shadow from the remaining part of the eyeball. Finally, I drew this very soft and fine line on said eyeball in a bow-like shape. Then I worked on the shadow between her nose bridge and eye. Make sure the nose bridge's edge is quite dark around the eye and that this crease running down next to the nose is quite distinct. Put a layer of pencil at the lower eyelid's outer rim, right beneath the lashes. And intensify the crease beneath her eye with charcoal. Next, I worked on the other crease between her eye and nose bridge. And added a soft shadow right beneath her nose wings. Again, connect the crease next to the nose bridge with her left nose wing by using your brush. Then I sketched out the soft shadow above her lip. However, make sure to leave a little bit bright space between that shadow and her lip. Additionally, I sketched out the shadow next to her philtrum, which automatically connects the previous two shadows with each other. I intensified the shadow running down from the corner of her mouth to the jaw, using the brush before dragging it upwards towards the eye to make it blend into the surrounding skin. Next, I used the loose brush again and went over the whole area. And erase parts that got too dark during this process. Then I worked on the shadow next to her nose bridge using charcoal. And connected it with the shadow beneath. Next, I got a little bit more into details concerning the shadow on her cheek and worked a little bit on the overall left side of her face. before adding the soft shadow right beneath her lower lip. Also, I lined out the small black space between both of her lips, first with the black pen, and made it a little bit bolder with the pencil. Then I turned to the area around her left cheek again, as well as to her chin and jaw. Next, I began working on the crease of her right eyelid. But while doing so, decided to switch to her nose due to an increasing danger of smudging. So first I darkened the upper part of the nose bridge at the height of her eyes. And sketched out these two creases again, next to the right side of the bridge of her nose. Then I darkened the outlines of her right nose wing once again with the pencil. As well as the right half of her nose tip. Additionally, I added some charcoal and brushed it out. Take the black pen to blacken out the darkest parts of the nostrils. Before adding black crayon and pencil. Next, I put a layer of charcoal on the right side of her nose tip, brushed it out and dragged the charcoal out upwards, following the nose bridge's outline until you meet its upper part between the eyes. Add a little bit charcoal at the remaining outline of the nose bridge on the left side and brush it out. Then I intensified the shadow next to the left side of her nose bridge a little bit, as well as the crease or shadow beneath her left eye. Next, I worked on the right eye again, beginning with the part over her eyelid in the same way we did on the other side. Next, I drag the shadow around the outer corner of her eye out. Towards her cheek, similar as on the other side. Additionally, I intensified the shadow on her right nose tip and next to her right side of the nose bridge. Before lining out her right nose wing and drawing a fine shadow beneath it, using the pencil and brush. Make sure that when you're shading in the bridge of her nose, the shadows on the nose bridge's outline are the darkest at the upper part, at eyes height and around the upper part of the nose tip. In between these two areas, the nose bridge's outline and its shading should become brighter. Also, don't make the shadow in between her eyebrows where the bridge of the nose grows out from the forehead too dark, but still dark enough so that it's one of the darkest parts of the forehead. Build it up slowly and always add just a little bit of charcoal or pencil if you feel like it's still too light. Drag the shadow out along the nose bridge's outline. Again, I darkened the upper part of the bridge of her nose, as well as the shadows next to it. Then I switch to the right eye for a short amount of time. And added the shading on the eyelids on both eyes. When I turn to the nose tip again, I intensify the shadows around its edges. as well as on the nose bridge. Make sure to separate the nose tip from the nose bridge by adding this soft, almost V-shaped shadow on top of the nose tip. Next, I worked on the bottom of the nose with the pencil and brushed it out again. When doing so, drag the shadow pretty far inwards, so it looks like there's a little triangle on the nose's bottom. Then I added a little bit of pencil to the little triangle at the bottom, so that it looks longer and almost connects with the little V shape. Then brush over the whole bottom part once more, as well as over the sides of the nose tip, right next to the little V-shaped shadow I was just talking about. Be aware to leave that bright space in the center. Before completing her nose wings. Next, I shaded in her right eye in the same way as we did with the left one. So, to complete the right side of her face, I began building up the shadow on the side of her cheek. Before adding the shadow directly next to the right side of her philtrum and the remaining part of the shadow above her mouth. Again, when you get to the shadow above her cupid's bow, give it a small V shape and drag it upwards towards her nose. To make the nose blend into the philtrum, I intensified the shadow beneath the bottom of her nose and the left outline of her philtrum. Then I worked on the shadow next to its right side, which I dragged out towards the right corner of her mouth, as well as upwards. Next, I carefully intensified the area beneath her right eye. As well as the shadow on her nose. I darkened the shadow below her lower lip and went over her mouth's outline one more time with the pencil. Now, lips are a little bit more complicated to shade in, since their surface is quite detailed, includes many fine lines and several irregular shadows, which often branch off in several directions. So I like to identify the single shadows being cast on the lips first, to take apart that network of lines and shadows, so to say, in order to be able to focus on single areas. I began shading in her lips with the pencil, starting with the small shadow between both lips, and drawing the small shadow running down from the right corner of her upper lip towards the left corner of her lower lip, along the lower lip's outline. When doing so, make sure to make the shadow along said lower lip a little bit irregular, in several small peaks, and to make it slightly darker at the lip's corners. Take the brush to smoothen the shadow out. I used the pencil to make the shadow beneath her lower lip a little bit more defined by carefully going over its outline again. Then I added the shadow below her upper lip by sketching out its shape with the pencil. And brushing over it again to drag it a little bit inwards. Make it darker towards the shadow's edges, especially on the right side, and add that fine line at the center, running down from the upper shadow towards the lower shadow on the lower lip. Draw another line at the lower lip's right corner, but make this one darker and a little bit thicker. Again, use the brush to make it blend into the shadow next to it. Then I made the shadow on the lower lip's outline slightly darker around both edges. And worked on the lower lip's left corner as well as on the upper lip by adding another fine shadow. I added another fine line on the lower lip, completed the shadow on the lower lip's top, and turned to the upper lip, where I completed the shadow we drew there a few minutes ago. I intensified the upper shadow on the lower lip, Edit another fine line running down towards the lip's bottom and drag the upper shadow further out. I used the black crayon to make the shadow between her lips a little bit darker. And placed some charcoal on the outer shadows of the upper lip before brushing it out. And going in again with the pencil. Next, I placed charcoal on the upper lip's edges or corners on both sides and brushed it out, going over the whole upper lip while doing so, to make everything blend into each other. Then I continued to fill in the lower shadow on the lower lip with the pencil and brush. And try to add several fine lines, connecting the shadows with each other. Put only a small amount of pressure on the pencil when filling in the remaining part of the lip, since it should get brighter towards the lip's center. Finally, I added highlights with acrylic paint along the lower lip's center, as well as a few dots on the upper lip center. To make them blend in even more, I brushed over the outer highlights on the left side of her lip. Last but not least, I completed the left side of her jaw, chin and cheek with the same technique as before. Additionally, I began to darken the part of her throat, framed by her hair, and sketched out the small shadow framing the sides of her face. Then I shaded in her ear, starting with the inner part . and turn to her throat again. Therefore, I added some charcoal on the sides next to the hair and brushed it out. I used the pencil to make the shadows darker directly next to her hair and drew the inner shadow running down from beneath her chin in such a boat shape again. Last but not least, I added a mole. Regarding the hair, I won't go much into detail since I've already done another tutorial for how to draw hair, and also I gotta admit that I'm not that thrilled about how it turned out in this case. I'm gonna link that tutorial for drawing hair down below in case you might be interested. So first I worked on the part of her hair, which sits directly on top of her head, so to say, and which isn't in the ponytail. This part is gonna be one of the darkest areas of her hair. I began drawing the smaller hairs along the hairline with the crayon. Try to draw in single strokes whenever you're drawing hair, to mimic its structure. Again, put more pressure where the hair is gonna be darker and less where it should be brighter. For the brighter parts in this area, I use the pencil. For me, it is the easiest to start by marking the darkest parts of the hair first, either along the whole head or just area for area, like in this case. Next, I drew a little strand of hair adorning her ear. When doing so, try to let the single hairs fade out a little bit by applying the least amount of pressure towards the tip. Then I continued filling in the remaining part of the non-ponytail area. Whenever I felt like I missed a few smaller shadows or darker strands, I carefully went in again with the black pen or the crayon. The lower sides along her forehead should be the darkest, and the hairs directly on the girl's hairline should be lighter than the hairs being more in the back. You can always use the white acrylic paint or pastel pencil to add highlights as a final touch. The area where the ponytail parts to each side and the hair falls downwards should be quite dark as well. However, the hair gets much brighter along the way until it gets darker again where it curls up around the neck. Try to keep the hair's movement and flow by visually dividing the hair into its thicker and more prominent hair strands, uniting all the single hairs falling in the same direction. Add a few hairs peeking out or breaking free from the ponytail to make it look more real.